Welcome, everybody. My name is Marlon Ruiz, and I'm excited to host today's Fireside Chat. Our guest today will be Charles Hoskinson. Charles has been in the industry for roughly 12 years, helping to guide the industry all the way back to Bitcoin. If we take a look at his bio, we can see that he's currently the CEO of Input Output Global. He's done a lot of advocacy for digital asset regulation. And before time, he was a founder for IOG, Invictus Innovations, Bitcoin Foundation's Education Committee, and also co-founder for Ethereum. Charles, welcome to the conversation. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me here, Marlon. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. So we talked last year, early in the year, so I'm hoping that your last year had plenty of activity and that all is going well. I'd like to start out our conversation with kind of a timely topic. We have this idea of the Bitcoin halving coming up right now. So I know that there's a lot of interest that you've had in Bitcoin over the years. So I'm just kind of curious for your thoughts on basically the halving, what's happening with the halving, as well as how BTC has been able to last so long and has no VC. So that's kind of like the opening salvo for our conversation. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, Bitcoin is the OG of ecosystems, and you know what it has going for it is it's very decentralized. There's a lot of integrity with the original intent, and it has stellar liquidity and market infrastructure. So it really is the digital gold standard of the industry. And every 4 years, for some reason, Satoshi decided to have a halving as opposed to a continuous reduction of inflation. So what ends up happening is that you typically have a flow and stock model where it creates a big surge of speculative value increase inside Bitcoin. So, you know, the first time I witnessed a halving was in 2012, and then it led to the 2013 bull run, and then again it happened in 2016, which led to the 2017 bull run. Happened again in 2020 and led to the 2021 bull run. So the hypothesis is that in 2024, it will create a bull run next year, if we believe the models, with probably an all-time high around $150,000, $200,000 Bitcoin. So the industry kind of plans around it, and everybody has an expectation, and this is one of those expectations become reality type things. So we're already seeing a lot of VC investment increase. We're already seeing a lot of projects start getting much more aggressive with spending in order to catch the wave, and it might become a self-fulfilling prophecy. That said, you know, this cycle is a little different because we have ETFs. This cycle is a little different because we have a radically different composition of actors in the ecosystem, and there's a lot of really good and interesting technology that finally found its way, you know, into the milieu. So like LightSpark, for example, which is just integrated into Coinbase, and you have over 100 million users now on the Lightning Network because of it. And you have a lot of really cool programmability and other things that are coming. You know, so I always try to give people their due, and Bitcoin is no different. Now, of course, I have reasons to believe that ecosystem is not the end all be all, and that's why obviously I helped create Ethereum and Cardano. But you know, it's a positive thing for the industry as a whole when you create more liquidity and you create more interest, and you attract a lot of good developers and talent to come in and start thinking about our problems and solving them.
Cool, thank you for that. I would like to actually understand a little bit about the creation of Cardano, right? The Cardano ecosystem uses extended UXTO. So I think that's obviously a nod to, you know, Bitcoin. However, I'd like to understand the differences and why you chose that path. I mean, there are many other people who built after you who chose a different path. So
Right.
You can shed a little bit of light on that choice, and how do you feel about that choice, and how's that working out in general for you?
So UTXO is cash register accounting. You know, so kids today, they're having a little bit of trouble with it. But, you know, if you're a little older, you actually used cash and you go and paid for things with $20 bills, $50 bills. Those are atomic units. You don't tear your $20 bill in half or something like that and, you know, give them half the $20 bill. You know, you give them the whole unit and then they give you change. So we're all used to that with a sufficient level of experience. The problem with UTXO and Bitcoin is it doesn't really carry a degree of state programmability. And so the question was, how do you extend UTXO so that you actually can do smart contracts? And you have to program them a little differently. It looks much more like a functional programming paradigm as opposed to an imperative paradigm. And also, you kind of think a little bit differently about parallelism and determinism inside the system. Now, why you want to do that as layer one is that if you look at the trajectory of all layer one blockchains, they have a rich and vibrant cross-chain and layer two world, and they also want to shard. Because you do a lot of stuff, you have an enormous amount of transactions. It's not really scalable to have a replicated system. And if you have this non-deterministic thing where you have to kind of create some sort of patch together global state, it is super, super hard to shard that, and super hard to get strong security guarantees about what happens on-chain and off-chain as they go back and forth. So a lot of the complexity of the Ethereum layer 2 ecosystem is a direct result of the account model that they use. So one of the things we did is we said if we could extend UTXO sufficiently that it gets a relatively equivalent expressiveness to the Ethereum EVM, this would give us a huge advantage when we start talking about payment channels, state channels, as well as side chains, layer 2s, all these types of things in our ecosystem. And we would also be able to preserve things that were really important to us. For example, determinism. So the things that happen locally should also happen at the network level, and also verifiability. So the semantics you think your app is going to follow, the code you write for the app, it's much easier to verify the program and all the different execution behaviors one would expect. So when you talk about SAT solvers, you talk about property-based testing, these types of things, you have a much more direct path of correctness, especially when you apply formal methods to your applications. We said, well, it's kind of like aerospace or big banking software. It's kind of a high assurance software domain. So pick an accounting model that matches the reality of where you want to go in terms of how you want to scale, and pick an accounting model that also helps you reason about the software's correctness, so that when you write applications, your QA is much easier and you get much more predictability of behavior. Now, why people typically don't do that, it's kind of like when you go from single core to multi-core, you have to learn new tricks, and you have to kind of learn how to load balance your UTXO graph, and there's a lot of additional things you have to do. And luckily, you could build models and patterns, kind of like we did in concurrency with the actor model or these things, to help you kind of think around and reason these things. But it's not as simple as just a straight up virtual machine and writing an accounts-based model. So you pay more complexity in your dev model upfront, but then you get a lot of downstream benefits. And when you think about the directionality of things over 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, a lot of that cost is going to be returned to you in spades when you talk about software maintenance and interoperability. So we bit the bullet and went down that road. And what's really cool about it is it's actually worked out really well for us. It was very painful the first 2 years, but we got to a point where we now have hundreds of dApps that are deployed, a lot of great design patterns. We kind of have this beautiful untyped core, and then we have different languages that have been written that compile to it. So we have like a Rust dialect, a Haskell dialect, and we're getting a TypeScript dialect. So we have pretty adequate representation of everything from the high assurance to kind of the web-oriented. Those three languages, I think, will be capable of covering 90% of people's dev needs. And what's nice is the community's built great libraries. We've built some libraries, and we're having a great time actually writing dApps in this paradigm. And then the next step is to kind of take it to the next level with Hydra, which allows you to go off-chain, and then take it to the next level with sharding, which is Ouroboros Laos, which we're going to announce here in a bit. And that will get us, that really, really high throughput. The other cool part is transactions per transaction. So if people go to eutxo.org, you can see this real time. It's a good blockchain explorer that visualizes the model. But what happens is one transaction can have many different unrelated events batched together. So you can issue some NFTs. You can also go ahead and interface with a DEX, and you can do a stablecoin transaction, and all those things are in one transaction. So over time, what happens is you can get fatter transactions which contain lots of outputs inside the model. So one unit of change actually under the hood changes a lot of things. So that's why extended UTXO is such a powerful thing, is that because if you think about where this is all going, all those outputs will be recursively compressed and start being less about directly changing the state, but more about a proof representation, and then behind it is like a roll-up or a layer 2 transaction and these things. And so you just get this amazing telescoping scale inside the system. You don't get that with a virtual machine like the EVM. It's not really built for that. And you don't have to really think around, God, how do I predict gas fees? And you have all these non-deterministic threads that chase down. Plus, when you want to sharding these graphs is significantly easier to deal with, and there's already beautiful formal logics like pi calculus and things like that that help you reason about that we've had for over 40 years in computer science, and thanks to Robin Milner and the other guys. So I just love the approach, and we're functional programming people. The guy who created Haskell works for us, Phil Wadler, these other things. So obviously you do what you know. And also Bitcoin created this model. They just didn't know how to extend it and create expressiveness. There was an initial attempt, and then there was an inflation bug that got everybody terrified. So they purposely scaled down the expressiveness and capability of the system and kind of kept it in a pseudo Turing complete world where you can't do very much on chain, which has hindered the smart contract side, but allowed it to be very reliable. We have 15 plus years of history there to draw from, to look to for it. So we're very happy with that extension. And we've written a lot of peer-reviewed papers about it, and obviously it's now working at scale for several years on the Cardano network. So you can actually see and parse the chain and understand all the consequences of the model.
Yeah, I would say just calling out a couple of different things, worrying about scalability, how do you move forward, as well as even just a paper aspect. My understanding is there are quite a few papers that Cardano has pushed out, or maybe over the last several number of years.
204.
Yeah, 204, right. So, it's great that everyone could take a read of it and everyone can learn from it. I feel like sometimes we're missing the idea of everyone working together and sharing their work. So I appreciate that aspect of what you have focused on for the most recent time. I'd like to just switch gears a little bit. We are in an election year, so that brings up a lot of fun conversations, but I'd like to just kind of focus on the idea of governance within crypto and Cardano's approach to doing that. And the idea that having this idea of governance is really not optional, right? It's something that has to be built in. Some folks have maybe thought about it after the fact. I think that you always talk about doing that from the beginning. So can you talk a little bit about the on-chain governance approach that Cardano is taking?
Yeah, governance is not optional. No matter who you are, what you do, when you create something that other people use, the first question people ask is, how do we upgrade, maintain, and change it to meet our needs? And who gets to decide when there's a collision? Like, everybody's friends until they're not. And then suddenly somebody wins, somebody loses, somebody has to decide. So that's why you construct governance systems. So there's a whole spectrum of governance of open source projects. There's a whole spectrum of governance of closed source projects. But cryptocurrency protocols are really interesting because it's governance around not just a capability, but also a resource. So your capability is the protocol itself and the things the protocol does for you. The resource is a token associated with the protocol that kind of gets things moving where they need to be. Now, no matter what you do, if you start abstractly looking, you go interact with Gemini for a little bit and talk to it, you start really thinking, okay, there's some common themes that come up with all governance. And usually there are three broad categories that you need to have in order for governance to work well for you. So the first category is democratic consent. So somehow, some way with your user base, you have to get them to consent to things you want to do, where you want to go. And that can be through delegation, that can be through direct voting, that can be from them electing representatives, kind of like a constitutional republic. You can do all kinds of different things, but there's some notion of, I agreed to this. If you don't, it's a dictatorship. The second, you have institutions. Institutions take very complicated things, and they convert them into yes/no questions. They convert them to up/down. They convert them to simple things that people can understand. For example, let's talk about like evolving TCP/IP or UDP. Oh, that's a really complicated question because there's so many stakeholders and other things. And if you have an institution like the IETF or something, then you can work through it, and maybe it's slow, maybe it's not slow, but you could at least make some meaningful change and get to a point of, here's a standard, should we support X, Y, Z, or A, B, and C? It's a simple decision once it's been distilled. And there's various degrees of efficacy of institutions, the legitimacy of it. Then you have constitutions, and constitutions are basically there as universal bills of rights for the people who use the system. So for example, if you're a Bitcoin holder, say, well, I signed up for, there's only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoin. So if Bill goes and says, hey, I want to do a hard fork and add another million Bitcoin because we're going to use it, like for marketing or something, like, doesn't happen because there's this social contract in case of Bitcoin implicit that basically says the monetary policy is fixed regardless if it's convenient or not. Okay, So constitutions protect the rights of minorities, and constitutions enable you to get some continuity and certainty. You can certainly change your constitution, but typically speaking, that takes a long, protracted, significant effort in order to get it over the fence. And so you typically only do that when there's an overwhelming demand amongst the governed to do that. So it doesn't matter if you're a nation state, you're a corporation, or you're a club or a protocol, you have to have some sort of sampling of these three things. Then on the other side of it, you typically look at three parameters that you measure in order to say, do we have a good governance system? You look at efficiency, you look at efficacy, and you look at integrity. So on the efficiency side, how quickly do we converge to making a decision? So some institutions are very slow, but they're effective in that when they make a decision, it typically is a good one. And Switzerland's a great example of that. Very slow-moving country. It's a confederacy. But overall, the standard of living is very good. The country is very stable. They haven't gone to war in 300 years. Most people say this is a good country to live in. So it's an effective leadership structure. Fiscally speaking, they're doing okay. But it's good luck getting things done quickly. You can argue over building a building in Zurich for 15 years if you've ever lived in Switzerland. It's a very painful process. On the other hand, you have governments that are very fast, or companies that are very fast at making decisions, but maybe they reverse decisions all the time. Like many of us have worked inside leadership teams or companies where one boss says one thing one day, one boss says another thing another day. It's like, I guess this week we're doing this and this week we're doing that. So it's a very efficient system, but it's not a very effective system if you're changing your mind all the time or making bad decisions all the time. Then you have like the China case where you have efficiency and effectiveness, but not necessarily integrity inside the process, depending upon your belief structure. So integrity is the hard one because it's always connected to belief structures. So if you value, for example, human rights, if you value, for example, freedom of expression and speech, if you value, for example, rule of law, all these types of things, maybe just maybe that particular regime is not your cup of tea because the types of decisions that they make tend to repeatedly violate those types of things in well-documented ways. On the other hand, if you don't value those things, it's incredibly hard to argue with the fact that they have all these high-speed trains and amazing infrastructure and the economy grows at an exponential rate. It's really remarkable to see what they've achieved. So integrity is really connected to your constitution and it's really connected to your base rules. So that's a framework to think about all of it. And what we try to do with Cardano is look at 2,000 plus years of governance history and pull all of that into a stack and say, could we do all three? So we founded an institution, a members-based organization modeled after Apache and Linux Foundation that allows it to go and take the product function and budget function of Cardano and take all that complexity and turn it to simple decisions to make. We created an on-chain representation system where people can register as DREPs and have a liquid democracy view where they can basically get delegated authority, but it could be revoked on demand like stake pools. And then also we have an on-chain constitution that we've written for Cardano that in some parts is machine understandable and constrains the governing class and prevents them from going a little crazy. And that's turning on in the next few months. And as it turns on, then we can start looking at its effectiveness, its efficiency, and also if it preserves and protects the integrity of the institution as a whole. So there are 7 different governance actions you can do, from initiating a hard fork to withdrawing from the treasury, because it turns out Cardano has an on-chain treasury with over $1 billion in it. So it's probably pretty important that that's well constrained and that there's some sensibility behind those outflows, to changing protocol parameters, to voting on arbitrary things, to firing certain members in the government or these other things. So it's a quite intricate thing, and we spent years thinking about it. And we were really inspired by like Peter Suber's work on Nomic. We were really inspired by a lot of work that was done by several governance experts throughout the world. And we looked at everything from the Internet Society to open source governance from Linux Foundation, things like that, that kind of give us that right framework. But it's as with anything, it's an experiment. And when you roll it out, you have to see where it goes. But my belief, this is the single biggest differentiating factor between cryptocurrencies, because the 2 other big guys, Bitcoin and Ethereum, and for to this year, Solana, have decided to recuse themselves from on-chain governance and basically leave it to either complete anarchy, meaning you can't really change anything, or leave it to basically consent of the dictator. A small group of people get to decide where to go and how to get there. And in both cases, I think that's the wrong model for something that you want to be around for 10 years or 50 years or 100 years. People need to understand that there's rights and protections, there's integrity, and there's a government that doesn't particularly care about which leader is in. It has enough operational resilience to be able to survive various things that kind of hit it, and it allows it to bounce back, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. So does that all fall within the SIP 1694 environment? It does, right?
Yeah, and extensions. So there's SIP 1694, there's the Cardano Constitution, and then there's Intersect. They kind of map into those three different pillars, and they give you end-to-end and on-chain government. And then recursively you look at it, and every year you try to improve it. So you try to update, modernize your constitution, and there's an on-chain mechanism to do that. And then you also look at the efficacy of the institutions, and if you don't like them or they're ineffective, you can fire them and replace them with other institutions. And that's why we even put in things like votes of no confidence. And so if enough ADA holders don't like it, they actually shut the whole government down and start over. So it's a pretty cool system, and there's a lot of political theory that went into it, and it's been very hard because we had to create consent. So we had workshops in 25 different countries. We even had a member of parliament from the UK come in and join us. His name is Marcus, and he provided a lot of great advice because he's doing it with real table stakes in the UK. And we've learned an enormous amount along the way, and we're at the final stages of implementation. And that's going to be done with right now with our testnet called SanchoNet, and very soon we'll actually start seeing a network scale upgrade be done, and then we actually get to see real time if the governance is working or not, which is pretty terrifying for me. But I hope we make a good contribution to it, because it's a model for all cryptocurrencies, whether you like Cardano or not. What Cardano does is it really goes out there and does really hard things, like how do you add programming UTXO, or how do you add governance to a blockchain, and it's a case study win or lose on what we learned, and it becomes useful for all builders because we don't have any patents. Everything is open source. All the code is under Apache 2. All the papers are under Creative Commons. So that's a public good, effectively, the lessons and the content and the capabilities for everybody to explore.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you have to not be afraid to fail for something so important that you have to get done. And if everyone works together, then you have a higher possibility, and everyone has an actual chance to speak their mind in an equitable way, that would make the difference. So appreciate your thoughts on that for sure. I do want to just give you a second to touch upon Intersect before we move on to the next topic. So did you want to just cover that TLDR version?
Yeah, I mean, if you're familiar with how the Linux Foundation works, where they have 140 projects from Kubernetes to Hyperledger under it, it's very similar. It's a members-based organization, and it has both the budget and product function of Cardano. So the annual budget, the discussions are held there, and the product backlog of Cardano, and how you go from special interest groups to a PRD to a TRD and these types of things, PRD, that whole process and flow is regulated there. And as an MBO, it's buy-in for the members. So the projects of Cardano join it, they participate in the working groups and committees, they create consensus. Obviously, various members have different levels of influence depending upon merit and contribution. And then the goal, in like any institution, is to turn complexity into simplicity. Yeah, and so each and every one of us have complex needs and wants. If you're an NFT project, maybe you want like royalties on chain, so it's easy for you to, every time you sell your NFT to get a royalty as the author or something like that. And maybe if you're a DeFi project, maybe you need some change to Untied Plutus core, so it's easier for your DEX to work or something like that. Who knows? Well, that's a request, and you have a product, problem description document, and you kind of write that down. Somebody has to go and grind that away and translate that to a collection of features that are prioritized in a backlog, so that engineers can go and work on that like they would any product.
Great, thank you for that. Switching topics a little bit to think about the future and somewhat similar to roadmap priorities. One of the biggest things that I've seen since I've been a fan or studying crypto is the idea of collaboration and community collaboration and partnering with other chains. How do things interoperate? These kind of very basic topics can be very complex as well. I've been following Midnight quite a bit, so I'm understanding that that's one of the first partner chains. Can you talk a little bit about why partner chains are needed, and also why Midnight for your first partner chain?
So there's this problem of how do you actually do interoperability? You know, the third generation has three pillars. There's scalability. Everybody talks about that. And we just talked about governance, but that third one's interoperability. How does everything talk to each other? And the problem is if your version of interoperability is everybody comes to my chain and everybody else dies, that's not exactly very satisfying. You know, like, could you imagine Wi-Fi if your Samsung phone only works with a Samsung router and your Pixel phone only works with a Google router? It'd just be nuts at the end of the day. So you need interoperability, which means you need the ability for chains to not only talk to each other, but to move assets, people, state, and other concerns across each other. So the web does this really well. You know, if you're an AI developer and you say, hey, you know, I want to do, an AI app where you upload your picture of a cat and it turns it into this beautiful cartoon or something. Well, then maybe you use Google or OpenAI and there's an API. So you collect that data, you send it over to a service, the service does something, it sends it back. That's a standard model. We all know how to do it. Multi-billion-dollar companies do this every day. Cryptocurrencies don't do that very well. So let's say Midnight, which is a blockchain built for computational privacy and also selective disclosure, meaning it allows you to add a privacy schema onto your application logic. If I go and say, well, the only way for Midnight to be successful is you have to migrate your Ethereum application or your Bitcoin application, your Solana app or Cardano app to it, it would work. Instead, I say, you just call it, you write the logic you need there, and then that adds computational privacy to your system, and then you pay your transaction fee in your underlying currency. So if you're an Ethereum user, it's Ether, you're a Bitcoin user, it's Bitcoin, Cardano user, it's ADA, and all aggregates there, and it kind of just sorts its way out. So we call this Cardano service layer model, and those are called partner chains. And the idea is that they have well-defined infrastructure, decentralized LLM, decentralized social network, decentralized telecommunication, like World Mobile is the partner chain, for example, which is building a competing cell phone network to go against Verizon and T-Mobile. You have a decentralized privacy stack, you know, and those need predictable pricing, and they want to sell that service to every app in the entire ecosystem. And they basically provide batteries included bridges that enable that to happen. And from an app development viewpoint, let you stay in the ecosystems you're comfortable in and where your customers exist, and you call it on demand. Otherwise, it either have to implement the whole thing on their side or they have to migrate to that entire ecosystem. And that doesn't make any sense. So it's really cool because that allows Cardano to extend itself in both the legacy direction, but also extend itself in the blockchain direction and start doing blockchain to blockchain sales. And Midnight really is the first blockchain we think is going to be able to keep a secret and do it well. Because no matter who you are, any business has a private side and a public side. If you're McDonald's, you're still probably not revealing how much money's in the cash register or how much you pay your employees or whose hours are where to the general public. You're just not doing that. So you need privacy there. But on the other hand, you know, when the HR comes or the tax man comes or these they have to have transparency. So there's a selective disclosure regime. It's the same with security tokens, carbon markets, supply chains, medical record systems. Any real life use case, there's always a disclosure and privacy schema that comes associated with that data. And there's some desire to compute and operate on it for a public good or for business good that you have. So we created Midnight for that reason. We've been working on it for 6 years. It's in testnet. So if you go to midnight.network, you can actually go and take a look at it. You write TypeScript to be able to interface with it. So it's pretty cool. I kind of want a Dart, but they liked TypeScript. So we kind of went down that road. And what's nice about it is that it's something that we can begin offering very soon across the entire blockchain ecosystem, and it creates a whole framework, and then that framework can be used by many projects that want to migrate. One of the coolest features, I'd say there's two, is the dual token model and also the existence of something called Minotaur, multi-resource consensus. So the dual token model means you separate the ownership, governance, and maintenance of the system from the fuel that powers the system. What we found is in the ownership side of tokenomics, people really like deflationary monetary policies. That's like Bitcoin, Cardano, and other ecosystems. Okay, well, that doesn't map very well if you're a business and you want predictable pricing. If I'm using a service layer, I don't want a situation where my cost of that service goes up 40% or 30% or down 20% on a weekly basis. You can't plan ahead. It doesn't make sense. You want to be able to pre-buy or have subscriptions or consistency in your price. And when they do change it, that they change it with, a regular cadence. You separate the two tokens, you actually can do this, where you have one with a deflationary monetary policy, and then you have another token that can kind of flow, and then you can create far more predictable pricing in the system for the resources of the system, so people get that certainty. And we think that's going to be very important for things like decentralized LLMs and algorithmic stablecoins, super important for computational privacy or decentralized infrastructure, or whatever people want. Minotaur is the other really cool one. It's a paper we wrote with Shireen, who later on went to create EigenLayer, and that is multi-resource consensus. So what it allows you to do is to chain multiple consensus algorithms together in one ledger. So instead of being, I'm a proof of work guy, or another, I'm a proof of stake person, you can combine them together and have proof of stake and proof of work. It's the peanut butter and jelly of the ecosystem. But you can chain n consensus protocols together. And what's so cool about that is that means then partner chains actually can divorce the main chain. When you look at the Parachains model, the Cosmos model, or any of these guys that have kind of this secondary primary model where you have a primary chain and these satellite chains that connect to it, they're like the Hotel California. You can't check out. Once you're in, you're in. Very hard to leave. With Minotaur, what you can do is you just basically reparameterize and say, you know what? We're going to get 30% of our security from Cardano, and then we'll get the other 70% from other chains or internally. And maybe you wake up next year and the owners of the system, the governance token, can say, hey, actually we want to become a true layer one and run everything ourselves. Or we're having consensus problems. We want to dynamically shift back over and let Cardano run everything for the time being. Like maybe Solana has an outage or Algorand has an incentives problem. They need to fix it. So let's let Cardano run the network for a year or something like that. So that's why we call it a partner chain instead of a side chain, because a side chain kind of denotes a servitory relationship. A partner chain denotes that they're working with each other. Cardano provides security and infrastructure and liquidity and users and all this beautiful stuff. And this other chain is paying for that with its inflation, but that's a partnership. And like any partnership, you can get stronger or you can get a divorce and move on. Minotaur is the first protocol built specifically to accommodate that. So we think it's going to be a great way of attracting a lot of amazing projects to come in, because it gives them a larger option space. And I kind of liken it way back in the day when Steve Jobs said, hey, we got to get off Flash. And he went to HTML5. Even though it was a less evolved ecosystem at the time, people liked the idea that they were building an open standard and they weren't locked into the whims and wills of a particular vendor. Same for Internet Explorer with ActiveX versus open standards. So whenever you create an open ecosystem, you typically actually create a reality where people migrate to that. And right now, when you look at these parachains or IBC or things, they don't really provide that. And for a service layer model to get all this stuff for free is a very powerful place. So it's one of our biggest bets we've made as an ecosystem. And we spent tens of millions of dollars in engineering, for facilitating it. There's big teams and a lot of stuff, and it's going to be really exciting to see that roll out in the coming 24 months and see how well it's received by the cryptocurrency ecosystem. But I do believe it'll create interoperability. Because, by the way, a partner chain can share its inflation with any ecosystem. So Ethereum may want to provide security for Midnight, in which case they actually like it because they get staking rewards, from it. So that's conceivable. It creates an alignment for interoperability as opposed to this siloed tokenomics disincentive for interoperability.
That's super fascinating. I think that most people don't think about it that way, where you want to create an open environment where you can pick up and go and decide to do different things along the way. So that seems to be, I'll just call it a radical approach, because I haven't heard too much about that kind of an idea. I've heard more about sidechains in general. So appreciate that thought process and being able to create a system that allows ultimate freedom and flexibility depending on your need, right? So everyone would have a different need at a different time, and you're accounting for that, which is pretty awesome. Great. Let's move on a little bit. I'd like to talk about just a general crypto environment, give you a chance to speak about something which I know you talk about a lot, which is the number go up versus building idea. The idea that maybe the token price is not actually the value of the price. It's a very interesting conversation because you've been in this industry for 12 years and you've seen the number go up and the number go down for everything around you. And it just doesn't almost make sense to always focus on the number beyond just the investment portfolio, but more of what is the purpose of things. So if you could talk about that, I'd be really interested to hear your opinion.
Well, I think there are three daemons that we have to slay in terms of quantification of blockchain ecosystems: decentralization, throughput, and network value. So decentralization, we created an index called EDI. If you post a link, people could see it. But it was created at the University of Edinburgh, and there's 8 different factors that they measure, and they allow you to actually answer the question of how decentralized is a cryptocurrency. It's kind of interesting, right? We all talk about it. You hear the word again and again, but what does it actually mean? And it's actually super hard to measure, and that's why you have to look at it from 8 different parameters. Second, in terms of throughput, what does TPS mean? Like extended UTXO is a radically different system than accounts. So one transaction can be like 100 transactions with us. So if we have 10 of those transactions, that's 1,000 transactions that just occurred. Seems like you have an incredible TPS rate. But if you're just measuring raw TPS, we're 10 TPS or something. Meanwhile, it's, accounts are running really fast, but it's a sequential process. Kind of ran into this with processors when we started going from single core to multi-core, and the clock rate wasn't going up, but the productivity of the processor was going up dramatically. So we had to create different metrics and benchmarks to be able to measure performance of CPUs and GPUs. And then finally, what you're asking is like this network value question. So what makes a cryptocurrency valuable? Now, in the investment world, we have things like Benjamin Graham's fundamental analysis that Warren Buffett was inspired by. It led to the creation of Berkshire Hathaway, tremendously successful. But at the end of the day, you can't really apply those standards in the cryptocurrency space. And the example I like giving is Dogecoin. It's like this thing that was just on the side of the street, basically dead. And then Elon Musk was walking by, he picked it up and dusted off and took it home and cared for it, kind of like Ned Flanders with the gremlin. And he turned it into this thing. And at any given moment, he could wake up and decide to integrate it into X. And what would happen is he would have 300 million users, and they would all have cryptocurrency wallets at X, and he could use it for payments and subscriptions and tipping, and it'd have gargantuan demand. So it's a meme coin, and it has no real utility currently, but one guy can just go and pick the gremlin up, dust it off, and give it some sweet love and train it, and then suddenly it grows up, and it's a big thing. So things change very rapidly. Scams can turn to legit things could turn into scams. And then also utility can radically change in a hat. Like, for example, Ethereum was a proof of work system. Now it's a proof of stake system. It has radically different notions. When you held Ether in proof of work, there was no positive carry. Now you hold it, there's a staking reward. The facts and circumstances of the entire system have changed. It's the same protocol, but now what does network value look like? So we try to aggregate this in markets, but the issue is the markets are also controlled. Less than 10 actors have a humongous influence on the overall liquidity and value of your ecosystem. The big exchanges, the top 5, control 90% of all trading volume, and the stablecoin, the asset-backed stablecoin operators, Tether and Circle. Their absence or presence and how they work within your ecosystem, plus certain VC actors, basically can create overnight a multi-billion-dollar ecosystem or prevent one from becoming very successful. So I'll give you a great example. Ergo is started by absolutely brilliant kid. His name is Alex Chirpino. He used to work for me, but he's been in space forever. He helped start Chainlink. He created Scorex, which is a modular blockchain framework, and he's a technical genius, a wonderful engineer. He wrote this incredible framework called Ergo that has all these new next generation ideas, useful proof of work and EPA-POWs and Sigma protocols. And he also is using extended UTXO in a slightly different way. And when you look at a structured project like that with no pre-mine or anything, it really does deserve to be in the top 25, but nobody lists it. So because it doesn't have listing, it falls way down and nobody cares about it. It's almost like a dead project, even though you have a founder who's been around for more than 10 years, who has an incredible track record, all this brilliant technology, and also there's a vibrant, amazing community there in Ergo it's very evangelistic and they're interesting. Okay, well, those 10 actors decided not to bless it. Meanwhile, they bless other things. And those things go to $80 billion, even though you have to turn them on and off occasionally, and half the transactions fail, and these types of things, and not to name names on it, but so it's deeply frustrating. And then you have this numbers go up crowd that go, your entire worth as a CEO, as an engineer, as a scientist, the ecosystem's entire worth of the protocol is whether you've had a 10x this year or not, which is just so crazy. Cardano, our TVL is up over 300%. There's 8 million issued assets. Our blocks are mostly full. You guys can see that in extended UTXO. There's tons of projects building and doing things. There's all these amazing upgrades coming to protocol that give you on-chain governance, and we have great scalability plans, all these things. But our number didn't go up as much as Solana, for example. So a whole cohort of people basically say Cardano's a dying project, Cardano's falling apart, going to fall out of the top 10, all the people there are incompetent, the roadmap is wrong, their leadership is wrong. Okay, and you say, well, you do burn tokens and bribe people to get some hype. Why? So they can get a price increase and dump. It's just a perverse, strange incentive, and it really shows you that we're measuring the wrong things and we're talking about the wrong things. So the reason I bring this up in relation to throughput and decentralization is that you have to balance these things as an ecosystem if you're doing judicious governance. The kinds of things you do to improve your throughput would probably increase your network value, however, perhaps would lower your level of decentralization. The kinds of things you would do to make the system more decentralized and resilient may lower your network value, could increase your network value, but lower your throughput inside the system. So North Stars and metrics are really important because they're all in a web and they're interconnected. And you guys run into this at Google all the time when you're building your large-scale computing systems or you're building products, cloud products, whatever. There's a load balancing consideration, there's a pricing consideration, there's a competitiveness thing. And you have to kind of decide, like, as you build the product, how much do you want to take advantage of your incumbency advantage and ecosystem versus be fair to the customer, and how much openness versus closedness, what do you disclose when what's proprietary, what's open source. So everybody has different levers they have to pull, but it's never an easy answer of what to do. Meta, for example, decided to take something that they've spent tens of billions of dollars on and fully open source it, or at least a big chunk of it. The Llama model. Other people are proprietary, and it's not really clear what is the best business model and how these things work and what will eventually create the most value for the requisite organizations. Because at the end of the day, it's shareholder appreciation in those two games. And they're taking radically different approaches. It's the same here when you look at Cardano versus Solana versus other things. We have a price reflection of these types of things. Okay, well, we had a price reflection of the value of NVIDIA 3 years ago. Look at the value today. We have a price reflection of the value of Intel today. And they're losing $8 billion a year doing all this fab work. Maybe in 2030, they're the most valuable company in the world because they displaced TSMC and they have the entire AI stack verticalized and they get their monopoly back. You see, so future value, current value, the different levers that you pull, the business models that you have, your time horizon is incredibly important. And unfortunately, the way the markets work right now, they don't really reflect that accurately. And they're very subject to insider manipulation, and they're very subject to black swan events, much more so than any other market.
Cool. That was a very deep explanation. I enjoyed that. I find it very interesting to understand everyone's perspective. We're so early that it's almost odd to look at value from a monetary perspective because everything's still being built, and what will be built and what will be finalized and what will it be in 5 years is kind of hard. So appreciate you just keeping going at it and trying to drive the best, and also working with the community through 1694 to get feedback from the people and to build an ecosystem that is governed for the people by the people. So really appreciate that. And I wanted to say again, just thank you, Charles, for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking time to drop by and hang out with the Googlers. Always our pleasure to see you, and just wish you the best.
Thank you so much, Marlon. This is always fun. I love the questions that come from the Googlers, one of the brightest companies around.
Thank you, Charles. Have a great day.
Thank you.